Tonight, we're traveling far back in time, to a world of stone towers, winding staircases, and ancient flags fluttering in the cold wind. You've likely seen castles in movies grand, noble, towering over green hills like something out of a fairy tale. But the truth was much colder, much darker, and far less comfortable. Behind those thick walls, medieval life was anything but charming. So, if you've ever dreamed of living in a castle, tonight's story might gently change your mind. Settle in, find a comfortable position, and let your thoughts drift as we quietly wander through the creaking corridors of history. And discover why these mighty stone fortresses were, in many ways, death traps. Let's begin. Let's begin with a simple image, a castle on a hill. The sun is setting behind its turrets, casting golden light on its stone walls. A flag dances slowly in the wind. Below, the quiet valley stretches out, dotted with grazing sheep and the winding ribbon of a river dot from afar. The castle appears timeless, imposing, magical dot for many of us. This is the image of the Middle Ages. We imagine gallant knights in polished armor, princesses with flowing gowns standing at high balconies, great halls filled with feasts and laughter, and flickering torches casting warm light on ancient stone. But history, like stone, has many rough edges, and castles, for all their grandeur, were not the cozy palaces we might wish them to be. Castles were, first and foremost, military structures. Their design had a singular goal: to withstand attack. Every stone, every stair, every passage was shaped by the logic of war. Thick outer walls to resist battering rams, towers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire for archers, arrow, windows to prevent arrows from entering, while still allowing defenders to shoot out, moats, drawbridges, murder holes. These weren't just dramatic features, they were survival tools. And with each added layer of defense came a layer of discomfort. Living inside a fortress meant constant awareness of potential threats. Every door was thick and heavy. Every hallway was cold and echoing. Every room was built to protect, not to nurture. Imagine waking each morning to the sound of wind howling through cracks in the stone. Your breath visible in the icy air. Rush of water in a distant cistern echoing down the corridors. Nowhere in a medieval castle was truly warm. Even the great hall, the heart of castle life, was hard to heat. One large fireplace might serve a vast, vaulted room barely enough to take the chill from the air. Servants placed tapestries on the walls, not just for decoration. Floors were covered in rushes, mixed with herbs, to mask the smell of unwashed feet and animals, and everywhere. Dampness, moisture crept in through the stone. Mold grew in the corners. Clothes hung near the hearth to dry, but often remained half-damp. Candles smoked, oil lamps sputtered, and the air was heavy not with warmth, but with the scent of old stone ash. And human closeness, asterisk stories often tell of grand banquets in castles, roasted boars, overflowing goblets, and music echoing through halls. And yes, such feasts did occur. For the majority of the castle's residents, daily food was simple, repetitive, and bland. Gruel, bread, cabbage, occasionally some meat, often salted beyond recognition. Nobles might dine better, but even their food lacked the richness we take for granted today. Spices were rare and costly. Fresh produce was limited to seasons, and refrigeration didn't exist. In winter months, the entire castle might live off preserved food, salted fish, dried fruit, and everyone, highborn or low, drank ale or weak wine because the water was often not safe. One of the most uncomfortable truths about castle life: sanitation. Medieval castles had latrines called garde-robes, which emptied into the moat or cesspits. These were often narrow stone rooms built into the wall, with a wooden seat over an opening. A cloak or curtain provided a thin veneer of privacy. In theory, these worked. In practice, they were far from pleasant. Smells lingered, waste accumulated, and moats, rather than being clean defenses, often became open sewers. Imagine the summer heat pressing down, and the odor rising from below. Add to that chamber pots in bedrooms, emptied by servants or apprentices into the same system. For all their majesty, castles were not sanitary spaces, and disease thrived in those conditions. Whether you were a noble, a knight, a servant, or a cook, castle life was exhausting. Servants rose before dawn to tend fires, fetch water from wells or cisterns, prepare food, clean rushes, and attend to the needs of dozens if not hundreds of people. Armor had to be oiled, horses fed, walls patrolled. Nobles had duties of governance, diplomacy, and local justice, and their lives were not idle. Women of the castles spun, sewed, managed households, and in times of war fended the castle themselves. Even children worked early as pages, scullions, or apprentices. They learned by labor. It was a world of endless noise, the hammering of blacksmiths, the shouting of guards, the barking of dogs. There were no quiet, private moments, no warm baths at day's end, no clean sheet waiting at night. As you settle deeper into your pillow, it may be surprising to learn just how long the myth of the romantic castle endured. Victorian artists painted glowing portraits of medieval halls. 20th century films romanticized knights and ladies. But behind the layers of legend, the stone remains the same, cold, cracked, and filled with echoes. To live in a castle was to live in a structure designed to withstand siege, not to comfort the soul. It was protection at a price, a heavy, constant price. In the next chapter, we'll walk through the daily realities of cold and damp, the parts of castle life that the legends forgot. For now, let your eyes rest. Let the myths melt away. You're safe and warm, unlike those who once lived within walls of stone. Let us now wander deeper into the walls of the medieval castle. We've spoken of the myths, the romance, the illusion of grandeur. But now, let's pause to notice the air, to feel it, to smell it, to inhabit, just for a moment, what it was truly like to live there. They, season after season. You see, the castles of Europe were not warm places. They were not cozy by the fire, nor bright with light. They were, in truth, immense structures of stone. And stone, for all its strength, holds a particular kind of chill. The cold was not something you escaped. It seeped into your bones. It lived in your fingertips. It lingered on the edges of your breath. Even in summer, when the sun was high and the valleys bloomed inside the castle, there was shadow and stillness and cold. In winter, the cold was not a guest, it was a ruler. From November to March, the castle did not just sit in winter, It became winter. Its stone floors, uninsulated and unforgiving, grew slick with frost in the early hours. Its walls breathed out a dampness that clung to everything. Wool cloaks stayed damp for days. Blankets only ever felt lukewarm. Most rooms had no fireplace at all. Only the great hall used for eating, meetings, and ceremonies had a hearth large enough to generate true heat. And even then, the warmth did not travel far. A few paces from the flame, your fingers would already begin to stiffen. Your breath would be visible again, drifting upward in soft white trails. Windows, if they existed at all, were narrow slits. They were designed for defense, not for light. And in many castles, those windows were simply open to the elements, shuttered only by wooden panels or oiled cloth. No glass, no insulation, just the slow movement of air, sometimes cold, sometimes colder. In the noble bedrooms, called solaires, small fire might be kept burning in a stone hearth. But wood was precious, and fires were tended carefully, not generously. Even for lord or lady, nighttime often meant retreating to bed early, not for rest, but for warmth. Thick woolen blankets, layers of undergarments, a hooded nightcap, and still the cold crept in. But the cold had a companion, dampness. Stone, unlike wood, does not breathe. It does not release. Moisture holds it. Rain from the roof would drip down unseen cracks in the masonry. Morning dew would seep into outer walls. Groundwater would rise through the foundations. There was no ventilation system, no airflow, no sun to dry the surfaces. The walls were cold to the touch. The floors held a slickness that never quite dried. Mold grew in the corners of storerooms and cellars. Rot claimed wooden beams in kitchens and armories. In the servants' quarters, beds made of straw or wool-stuffed sacks would feel cool and slightly clammy to the skin. The air itself was heavy-laced, with the scent of wet stone, old firewood, and the faint trace of mildew. Clothing hung near the hearth in hopes of drying, but in most cases it remained slightly damp-soft and cold to the touch when dressed in the early morning hours. In such an environment, joint pain and illness were not occasional afflictions. They were companions. Stiff fingers, aching backs, persistent coughs, these were the rhythms of castle life. And when you think of the cold, remember that it was paired with darkness. The sun set early in medieval winters. By late afternoon, the sky would fade to gray, and the inner halls would turn to shadow. Candles were precious. Tallow, made from rendered fat, was unpleasant and smoky. Beeswax candles, far better, were reserved for the church or nobility. So most people worked, ate, and moved about in dim light, or none at all. A single torch might flicker in the hallway. A lantern might swing gently near the stairwell. Most of the time, people moved by feel. They knew the walls, the texture beneath their feet, the sound of their own footfall against stone, and in the absence of light, the cold became more powerful. The darkness made it feel deeper, more absolute. You could sit in a chamber beside a fire, but the corners of the room would remain invisible. The heat would never reach them. It created a sense of smallness, of being surrounded, not just by walls, but by the sheer mass of the structure, by its silence. Even food did little to ease the chill. Meals were hot when served, but cooled quickly on wooden plates. There were no ovens to warm a room, only open hearths. And in the early morning, when servants rose to begin preparations, the kitchens were colder than the outside air. Cooks often worked with fingers stiff from the night. Water was drawn from icy cisterns. Bread was stored in rooms that never rose. Above freezing in winter months, and water, if not warmed by fire, would freeze in buckets left overnight. It wasn't unusual to see one's own breath while eating dinner. In the great hall, where torches burned and dogs lingered by the fire, people still kept their cloaks wrapped tightly around them. There were no slippers, no central heating, no gentle background hum of warmth. Just the flicker of flame and the weight of your own clothing against the air. Now, imagine retiring for the night. There is no overhead light, only a taper candle burning down slowly, giving off a faint yellow haze. You remove your outer cloak, your boots, your leather belt. The stone floor beneath your feet is cold enough to numb your toes. Your bed is a wooden frame, strung with rope or leather strips, holding a mattress made of wool or straw. The sheets are rough, the blankets heavy, and everything smells faintly of smoke, wool, and the dampness of the room itself. The fire in the corner crackles, but the heat does not reach far. The window, shuttered with oiled cloth, lets in the sound of the wind, and the walls, they do not move, they do not give. They simply hold the cold in place, like a memory frozen in time. You curl tightly beneath your layers. You try not to. Think of the rat in the walls, or the sounds of others waking in the night. Because in a castle, night was never truly silent. There were guards pacing stone corridors, dogs growling in their sleep, the creak of wood settling, the faraway clang of metal echoing faintly from the blacksmith's forge. It was not frightening, but it was never quite peaceful, and that is what must be remembered. The cold was not an event. It was not a season. It was a condition. It shaped decisions. It limited comfort. It slowed every task. It deepened the silence. And for many, it was simply accepted. They did not expect warmth. They did not expect relief. They moved through their lives wrapped in wool and hope, sleeping early, waking stiff, living slowly as we drift forward. Let us now explore not just how the castle felt, but how it was built to resist intrusion, and in doing so, became a place of hidden dangers all its own. We've now felt the cold, the ever-present damp, the slow ache of discomfort that shaped life within medieval castles. But there was something else, something embedded into the very bones of the structure. These buildings were not meant to welcome. They were meant to repel, to confuse, to trap. And in doing so, they became dangerous not just to enemies, but to the very people who called them home. Let us walk carefully now, through hallways not made for ease, but for defense, through doors that creak with secrets, and steps that remember every fall. Perhaps nothing symbolizes medieval defense more than the spiral staircase, winding upward within narrow towers. These steps were not symmetrical, not gentle, not open. They twisted clockwise on purpose. You see, most soldiers were right-handed. By designing a staircase that spiraled up to the right, the castle gave an advantage to its defenders. O's coming down the stairs. A right-handed man descending could swing his sword freely. An attacker climbing up would have his movement restricted, his right hand pressed against the inner wall, unable to maneuver. It was clever, it was strategic, and it was treacherous. Even for the castle's own inhabitants, those stairs were narrow and uneven, made of stone, often without railings, and rarely lit. They curved tightly like the shell of a snail. The inside step was shorter, the outside step longer, and uneven rhythm that could easily trip a distracted foot. Imagine climbing those stairs in the dark, carrying water, or food, or wearing armor. Imagine slipping, and many did. Some steps were intentionally made irregular, wider, then narrower to slow progress or trip the unfamiliar dot in battle. That might save lives. In peace, it created injury. Above some gates and narrow passageways, there were openings, subtle at first, nearly invisible. These were called murder holes. Their name says enough. From above, defenders could pour boiling water, heated sand, or hot oil down onto invaders. Rocks, too heavy, sudden, unstoppable. But what is often forgotten is that those same holes remained open at all times. No grate, no cover, just a dark, forgotten space in the ceiling. Children playing, servants walking, a poorly placed ladder or stool. It wouldn't take much to create an accident, and in the absence of modern safety standards, accidents were frequent in some castles. False floors were used as traps, wooden planks that could be pulled away in emergencies to drop enemies into lower chambers. Sometimes these were forgotten, left unlocked, or misused. For a castle designed to trick its enemies, there were few warnings for its friends. Most doorways in castles were low and narrow. Again, this was intentional. A man bursting into a room would be forced to duck, making him vulnerable. In battle, this split second could be the difference between life and death. But in daily life, those doorways caused more bruises than victories. Head. Injuries were common. Children ran into stone edges. Elderly family members, especially in winter when light was poor, misjudged their step and collided with hard corners. In some castles, steps led directly down after the threshold, meaning you might open a door and, without caution, tumble immediately into a stairwell. There were few handrails, no signage, no modern code, just familiarity and the hope that memory was enough. Though stone cannot burn, castles were not immune to fire. Torches lined the halls. Tallow candles, smoky and greasy, stood atop wooden tables. Rushes on the floor dried. Plants laid to keep feet warm were flammable, and much of the interior furniture was wood. There were no chimneys in many early castles. Smoke from the hearth filled the room, rising into rafters, lingering in corners. People lived with it. They breathed it, and sometimes a sudden gust of wind or a carelessly placed cloth would ignite. There were few organized firefighting systems. A chain of servants with buckets was often all that could be done. Some fires were extinguished, others burned until they ran out of fuel. The combination of fire and stone created other dangers. Too, in cold weather, sudden heat from fires could cause stone to crack or joints to shift. Roofs, especially if made from thatch, could catch from chimney sparks. And because the windows were small and air flow poor, smoke often choked a room before the flames even spread. It was not a question of if a castle would suffer fire, only when. There were castles where architects went even further. Some included trapdoors hidden beneath rugs. Others had stairs that collapsed inward if a particular brick was triggered. Most of these were built in paranoid times, designed to stop assassins or raiding parties. But when they were forgotten, when new owners inherited the property, when children wandered into unused wings, the very things meant to protect became silent threats. There are stories, quiet ones, of lords who disappeared in their own homes, of servants who fell through loose boards, of visiting merchants who took the wrong step in the dark. And in a time before insurance, before emergency rooms, before any reliable medicine, a broken leg could mean death. A fall from the tower was final in these structures. There were always corners no one cleaned, tunnels below ground, storage rooms, forgotten stairwells, behind the ovens, beneath the chapel, beside the armory, places only rats knew well. And those corners were not just dusty, they were unsafe. Stone, degraded, wood. Stairs gave way. Yet in times of siege, people were sometimes forced into these very places. They became hiding spaces, makeshift shelters, crowded with people, food stores, and livestock. And when a floor gave way, or when air turned foul, there was nowhere to run because the castle was sealed, not just to outsiders, but to escape. And so, a strange thing emerged. Even in peace, even in times of plenty. There was a quiet unease that lived within castles. Not dramatic, not loud, but present. Children learned not to run. Servants learned which steps to avoid. Nobles moved slowly, not out of grace, but out of caution. People did not trust the building. They respected it, feared it, endured it, but they did not love it. It is easy to admire these places now, to visit their ruins and marvel at their design. But to live in one was to live inside a machine of defense, a maze of stone and shadow, and every feature, every stair, every corner, every door and step reminded its residents that the building was never meant for comfort. It was built to survive, and surviving inside it was a skill of its own. Let us now imagine the castle in a different light, no longer just cold or dark or inconvenient, but surrounded, cut off, pressed in from all sides. This was the moment castles were built for. The siege, and though many castles never experienced it, the fear of siege shaped every wall, corridor, stair, and storehouse. It shaped the routines. It shaped the people. And when siege finally came, it revealed the true limits of stone. There was rarely surprise. Sieges were not sudden raids. They were slow, looming storms. In the distance, watchers would see dust rising from the march of men and horses. Runners would report the burning of nearby villages. Farmers would abandon fields and flee inside the walls. The gates would be shut, the drawbridge raised dot, and then the waiting would begin. Outside, armies gathered. Sometimes only 100. Sometimes 10,000. They brought siege engines, trebuchets, ballistae, battering rams. But often they brought something worse. Time, because to starve out a castle did not require fire or stone. It required patience and silence. Inside the castle, everything changed. Rooms once used for storage became shelters. Chambers once quiet became crowded. Nobles, soldiers, cooks, farmers, and livestock, all within the same stone shell. Ventilation grew poor. Waste accumulated. Food began to be rationed, carefully, then desperately. Water was a particular concern. If the castle had a well, it was guarded like gold. If not, cisterns were used, but these grew stagnant, tainted, green, and the air grew still. The great hall no longer rang with feasts. The kitchens no longer roasted meat. Instead, there was the smell of boiled roots, stale bread, and bodies pressed too close together. Castles prepared for siege in times of peace. Grain was stored in sealed barrels. Salted meat hung from rafters. Cheese was aged in underground rooms. But no preparation was ever perfect, and no one knew how long a siege would last. At first, meals were normal, just smaller. By the second week, variety vanished. By the third, meals came twice a day. Then once, a stew of onions and cabbage, a handful of oats, a bit of dried meat, carefully sliced. Eventually, even the rats became part of the menu. Pigeons trapped in towers, dogs in the worst of times, and water once clear turned cloudy. Boiled, strained, prayed over. Some drank wine diluted with snow and fell ill. Privacy vanished. The Lord's chambers were no longer private. Families shared rooms with strangers. Servants slept beneath stairwells. Children curled beneath tables. The air grew thick, not just with smoke and sweat, but with tension. Arguments flared in whispers. Disputes over food. Discomfort over noise. There were no baths. There was little quiet, and sleep came slowly. Every creak of the wall, every gust of wind, every howl in the night might be the start of something worse. Not everyone huddled inside. The castle's defenders, knights, archers, and guards lived on the walls. Rain or sun, day or night, they scanned the horizon. They tested weapons. They watched for movement. In cold months, their hands froze around bowstrings. In hot months, the sun cracked their lips and boiled their armor. When siege engines fired, they ran to patch the breach, to return arrows, to douse flames, and they knew always that if the enemy broke through, they would be the first to fall. Outside the castle walls, the besieging army made its camp. They built trenches, raised siege towers, constructed catapults. Sometimes they shouted threats over the walls. Sometimes they played music to unsettle those inside. But often they were quiet. They waited, and while they waited, disease came for them too. Unburied waste, rotting food, fever in the tents. Sometimes the besiegers died before the besieged. Sometimes they left. Other times they waited longer until the gate cracked, or the drawbridge fell, or someone inside betrayed the walls. For those inside, death came slowly, first through hunger, then through disease. Fevers spread in the cramped rooms, infection from wounds, coughs passed from mouth to mouth. There were no doctors, only prayers and poultices, and hope. The chapel was full, and then the crypt bodies were buried shallow, when buried at all. Sometimes thrown from walls in desperation. Sometimes burn to keep disease from spreading. But the smoke from burning flesh did little to calm the nerves of those who remained. And so, the siege was not just a test of walls, but of the mind. Days without sunlight, nights without sleep, meals without nourishment. It wore down the strongest. Children cried quietly into cloth. Servants forgot the date. Lords stopped giving orders. People stared into the fire for hours and whispered to themselves in the dark. Even the silence of the enemy grew oppressive, a reminder that they were still out there, waiting. Some sieges ended with relief. The enemy withdrew. Reinforcements arrived. A deal was struck, and slowly the doors were unbarred. Light returned. Air moved. People emerged, blinking, thin, pale, changed. They buried the dead, cleaned the rooms, restocked the cellars, and they told stories of what they had seen, of what they had lost. But the castle remembered. Arrow scars in the stone, burn marks near the gates, blood on the stairs. And the people remembered, too. For years afterward, some refused to sleep near the outer walls. Some would flinch at the sound of drums. Some never again ate cabbage soup. And though life returned to rhythm, there was always a knowing silence beneath it. Because once the castle had been closed, once it had become a tomb as much as a fortress. Something changed in the way people moved through its halls. The castle was strong, but strength came with a cost. And for those who lived through siege, the cost was written into their bodies, their faces, their memories, their steps on the worn stone floor. The castle looms in memory, its towers, its chill, its design. But stone alone does not make a castle live. It is the people who move quietly through its passages, the hands that carry, clean, cook, and lift, who give the fortress breath. And in no place were these hands more essential or more overlooked than in the servant class. Today, let us descend into the quieter world, the world of those who never dined in the hall, who rose before the Lord awoke, and who often fell asleep long after the last torch was snuffed within the castle. Even among servants, there was order. At the top were the stewards and chamberlains, overseers of operations. They did not clean or carry directly. Instead, they directed others to do so. Below them were the cooks, the laundresses, the stable hands, the pages, the scullions, and the maids. There were those who tended to animals, those who fetched water, those who emptied chamber pots, and those who stirred soup over smoky fires for hours each day. There were servants who never saw the sky for weeks, others who never stepped inside the great hall. Their castle was different, smaller, narrower, colder, a warren of back staircases, storerooms, and cellars. Their day began in the dark. Before the cock crowed, before the fires were lit, they rose, in silence, dressed in rough wool, and stepped into corridors still wrapped in frost. The kitchen staff began first. They fed the fire with yesterday's ash. They boiled water for stew, gathered grain for bread, and chopped herbs. Meanwhile, scullions, the lowest-ranking helpers, hauled water from the cistern or the well, barrel after barrel, across uneven stone floors. Often, in the rain or snow, they moved without recognition. Their hands red from cold, their backs bent from weight. Above them, chambermaids aired bedding. They beat dust from straw mattresses, wiped down wooden walls, scraped candle wax from stone ledges, and always they worked in silence. To be noticed was a risk. To be forgotten was safety. Some duties were essential, yet unspoken. The gong farmer, for example, was tasked with cleaning the cesspits. He descended into the dark beneath the garderobes, those crude toilets suspended above the moat. Armed with a bucket, a shovel, and a cloth tied around his face, he removed waste by hand, hauling it out to be dumped far from the walls. There were rat catchers, too. Armed with traps and poisons, they patrolled cellars and storerooms, always watching for signs: stewed grain, gnawed wood, small dark pellets, and laundresses who boiled clothes in steaming vats of lye and ash, scrubbing wool until their knuckles bled. Their work was not elegant, it was not clean, but it was life-sustaining. Servants ate apart from the lords. Their meals were simpler: boiled root vegetables, coarse bread, weak ale. If the nobility feasted on game and wine, the leftovers might trickle down: a crust of meat, a spoonful of thickened stew, bones for broth. They ate in shifts, often standing. Plates were shared. Salt was rare, and they returned to work before fully full, because there was always more to do. Servants did not sleep in the main chambers. They lay where space could be found, in lofts above the kitchen, beneath staircases, or in unheated side rooms. Their beds were straw on wooden frames. Blankets were thin, reused. Some shared coverings, others curled against stone walls for warmth. Sleep came not as rest, but as pause, interrupted by the next knock, the next bell, the next spill to clean. They were roused early, and rarely dreamed. To be a servant in a castle was not temporary. It was a lifelong condition. Some were born into a children of servants, trained from early age. Others were indentured, paying off debts. Some were taken in from orphanages or poor farms. There were no weekends, no holidays, except those recognized by the church. And even then, work rarely stopped. Marriage was rare. Privacy rarer still. Their names were recorded not in books, but in passing memory at all. They wore the same clothes for seasons. They used the same tools for years. Their days blended one into the next, and yet the castle could not run. Without them, though they bore no swords, servants lived dangerously. A dropped plate could mean a beating, a spilt drink, a lost position. Rumors were punished, romance was forbidden. Accidents were unpaid. In plague years, they were first to die. In war, first to be sent out. In famine, last to eat. And if the castle changed hands, if a siege succeeded, if a lord fell from favor, servants were often dismissed, or worse, they had no protection. Their loyalty was expected, their sacrifice unseen. And yet, even in this hardship, there was life. Laughter in the kitchen when the Lord was away. A song hummed over the bread dough. A quiet kindness passed from maid to boy. A shared crust of honeycomb saved for someone old. There were moments of pride, too. A floor scrubbed until it shone. A fire kept alive through storm. A lord's compliment, rare and quiet, but real, and so the servants endured. Because they had. 2. Because they had no choice. Because in the rhythm of their labor, there was something steady, something ancient, something shared. When visitors came, they saw the banners, the gates, the Lord on his chair. But what they did not see were the hands that dressed him, the feet that swept behind him, the voices that whispered in corners. They did not hear the splash of water at dawn, or the clatter of buckets behind the wall, or the silent sigh of the scullion folding his aching knees beneath the stone. Steps to sleep, but they were there, always there, keeping the fire lit, keeping the rooms dry, keeping the castle alive, and long after the nobles left, long after the towers crumbled. The servant's presence lingers in the stones, in the soot above the hearth, in the soot above the hearth, in the grooves on the table where countless meals were served by those whose names were never spoken aloud. Now the castle falls quiet again. Its stone remembers the footsteps, the work, the weariness, but also the rhythm of life. We've walked the cold halls, felt the weight of defense, heard the hush of siege, and now we've knelt beside those who labored unseen. Next, we say farewell, with one final breath in the outro. And now, dear listener, we reach the quiet end of our walk through stone and shadow, through the winding staircases, the cold kitchens, the walls that once stood strong against invaders and against time. We've wandered together through myths and truths, not the fairy tale castles of books and paintings, but the real ones, the damp ones, the dangerous ones, the ones filled with quiet footsteps, cold air, flickering torchlight, and stories lost to the dust. Perhaps now, as you rest your head, you can feel those thick walls surrounding you, not with threat, but with memory. You've walked the spiral stairs. You've stepped through arched doorways meant to slow your movement. You've ducked under murder holes and crouched near fires that never truly warmed the air. And you've met the people, the ones who stirred the pots, who changed the linens, who slept beneath the staircase and rose before dawn. You've listened to the silence of siege, the hunger, the whispered prayers, the thin, rationed light of hope. You've felt what it meant to live not above, but inside stone. And now the torches are dimming. The doors have been barred for the night. The kitchens are still. The last servant has folded her apron and curled. Beneath her blanket in the servants' hall, the wind has died. The castle breathes only in memory now. Let it settle around you. Let the weight of it drift through your thoughts, like falling dust in an undisturbed chamber. You are safe now, not behind battlements or moats, but in the stillness of understanding. You know what once was, and you can let it go. Let the cold become quiet. Let the danger become distant. Let the footsteps of history echo softly behind you until they fade and only sleep remains. Rest now, traveler of time. You've walked a long path through silence, stone, and forgotten rooms, and the castle will keep its watch just a little longer.